Well, good afternoon. It's great to be with you. Great to be with you, Sebastian, here today. So let me just start briefly by saying that it's a rare treat to get to read a book where not only do you get a little bit of someone's personal story, but you also get a little bit of military history, a little bit of foreign policy, and a little bit of Donald Trump. So I want to ask you first, Sebastian, if you wouldn't mind, to take us through the story of how you first met Donald Trump and how it was that you came to then become his deputy assistant in the White House.
Absolutely. Everybody wants to have the personal story first. But before I do that, I'd like to say thank you to you for being here today, and especially for the Commonwealth Club that truly understands what respecting diversity of thought means. In an age where people are being permanently banned on social media for expressing an opinion that some people disagree with, this is the American tradition, that you listen to people and then you make the decision. So thank you to the Commonwealth Club. So my journey, I think, is a typically American journey because I am a legal immigrant to the United States. My parents escaped dictatorship. My parents were children during World War II, lived under the fascist occupation of Hungary. My father was an anti-communist after the war, arrested, tortured, and imprisoned for life at the age of 20. Spent 2 years in a prison coal mine, 2 years in solitary, not 2 months, not 2 weeks, 2 years in solitary as an enemy of the state, and then was liberated by the freedom fighters of 1956. And with a 17-year-old daughter of a fellow prison mate, literally crawled through a minefield to escape to liberty. That's what an asylum seeker is. That's what a refugee is, not a person who throws bottles or rocks. So for me, when people talk about refugees and asylum seekers, it's a personal story. They escaped to the West. I was born and raised in the UK, but speaking Hungarian. My first language was Hungarian. After the fall of communism, I went to work in the first freely elected democratic government in Hungary, spent 5 years in the defense ministry, met my American wife. We set up a think tank. And then 9/11 happened and my life changed, as for many people. I was invited after 9/11 to teach a US-funded Defense Department program on counterterrorism. I did that for 4 years with a legend in the Marine Corps called Nick Pratt. And then 2008 came and we decided to move to America, and I moved my family to the US, hoping to leave socialism behind in Europe, only to have it follow us for the next 8 years. But as an immigrant, this is so American. I was an immigrant. I wasn't even a US national, but the Defense Department invited me to become a professor at National Defense University. One of the most emotional moments for me was when a first day of indoctrination, filling out all the forms, my TSP, you name it, all my government guff. And at the end of the day, a naval officer said, "Come with me." And she was the head of HR. She said, "Raise your right hand." And I took an oath to protect the national security of the United States from enemies, foreign and domestic. And I wasn't even an American. That's America. That's meritocracy. That's values before your skin color, your gender, your accent. And then for 6 years, I worked in the Defense Department, teaching the master's degree in irregular warfare in DC. Ended up at the Marine Corps University with an endowed chair. And in the summer of 2015, I get a phone call. I'm in Quantico, and I get a phone call from a guy called Corey Lewandowski. Didn't know him from a hole in the wall. And he said, I work for candidate Trump, who's preparing for the big GOP debate this fall. The fall of 15 was the big national security debate of the, 17 candidates we had. And he'd like to talk to you about national security. Would you come to New York? Not expecting that call. I said, okay, sure. So I flew to New York, went to Trump Tower, met with the president and Corey, just the three of us in his private office. The president, the future president, was closer to me than you are right now. And we had this incredible discussion, the free-ranging blue sky discussion for 40 minutes on, you name it, civil war to nuclear weapons to the Middle East to ISIS. And halfway through, the president does a classic Trumpism. He kills the conversation dead, turns to Corey and says, "I like this guy, let's hire him." Classic, decisive Donald Trump. And I signed an NDA. I became an advisor to the Trump Organization on National Security, wrote him some policy papers for the debates, got to know General Flynn, and eventually ended up on the official transition team. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but in the federal government, there's this peculiar system. The last two candidates of each party are actually federally funded to establish a transition team to prepare their takeover of government should their candidate win. So I came onto the NSC transition team under General Flynn. My wife joined on the DHS team, and then we won the election. And I was expecting, until the day of the inauguration, I was expecting to go and work on the NSC doing counterterrorism issues, which is my thing. And then in the last moment, a guy called Steve Bannon, who knew me from Breitbart, said, "You're working for me." So he took me into this office of the chief strategist to the president. I became strategist to the president as his deputy. And I worked, Bill O'Reilly called me national security utility infielder. I think that's a sports reference. I play rugby, so I couldn't tell you. And then I spent 7 months doing all kinds of things, national security for the president, and it was the highest honor I ever had, until a fateful vacation in the summer of 17, where, without telling me, Steve Bannon resigned, and I'm on a holiday, thinking, what do I do now? And for the last couple of months, an individual called H.R. McMaster had been systematically boxing me out of key meetings because he didn't like me or the MAGA agenda. And I realized it would be improper of me to pick up a not insubstantial government paycheck just to do a couple of TV hits for the president each week. So I wrote a letter of resignation and said, I will support you from the outside. And the president has stayed in touch, and he agrees that some things are much easier to do on the outside.
So you mentioned this meeting that you had with him back in 2015. What were your first impressions of him at that meeting? What was that? You've got a deep background in thinking about these issues,
Right.
teaching about them. I mean, you clearly have spent a lot of time
Right.
formulating your opinion. What was your sort of first impression of him?
A couple of things. To be honest, I was a little trepidatious of this meeting, because I've lived in DC for a decade now, and it is a swamp. I mean, it is an utter, complete swamp. When I lived there previously for a year in the 90s, I immediately recognized the nature of this city by what I call the Washington handshake, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. You go to the fancy cocktail parties in Georgetown, Adams Morgan, some diplomatic function somewhere, and you're trying to, work the room, say hello, introduce yourself. And as you are shaking hands with this stranger, they're already looking over your shoulder to see if there's somebody more important coming into the room. I mean, that's DC. So I expected this to be another chameleon, another Janus-faced politician, which of course he isn't. And everybody always wants to know that, they may like Why We Fight, or my prior book, Defeating Jihad, but they always want to know, what's he really like? Everybody wants to know, what's he really like? And I hate to burst your bubble. If you've got a pulse and have been alive for the last 50 years and switched on a television or read a newspaper, you know Donald Trump intimately. Because there is none of that falsity. There's none of this public persona, and then behind closed doors, I'm completely different, and I'm a scoundrel, or the opposite of what I say is what I believe. What you see in public in a stadium full of 60,000 people is what he is like behind closed doors in the Oval Office. So number one, Trump is Trump. Secondly, and this is the thing that clinched it for me, that made it a very easy decision to work for him, I realized within seconds that Donald Trump is the kryptonite of political correctness. He cannot abide it. He detests political correctness in his marrow. And for me, political correctness is Orwellian doublespeak, or newspeak, right, from 1984. It is newspeak for censorship. It is dictatorial. Political correctness is an attempt to control the way you think by policing the words you're allowed to say. Twitter is now banning people for, what is it, dead naming? Dead naming. If you, listen, pay attention to this. Dead naming is the latest crime that Twitter will block you for. Well, no, will delete your account. If you refer to somebody who is biologically a man, okay, John Smith, and they decide they are a teenage woman called Jill, okay? If you refer to them by their name, John, you are dead naming them. Because that person is dead. Because they think they're Jill today, reality has changed. And for that one accurate description of reality, you will be banned permanently. So political correctness washed like a tide over America, built and built and built. And I saw a man who said, basta, this is nuts, enough. And those were my two immediate impressions. And when it comes to the substance of the discussion, I was shocked. I mean, this is clearly a man who may not have a library of Victor Davis Hanson's books on Greek warfare, and I love Victor, but he really has, or had back then, a layman's fascination with strategic issues. I mean, he wanted to talk about aspects of the Civil War. He wanted to talk about, the paradoxical non-utility of nuclear weapons. These are big, big issues. Not what I expected from a billionaire real estate developer and TV show star.
So I want to get to the book.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about the book because, as I said, I think it's a fascinating book from the perspective of a little bit of your life story, a little bit about policy, and also these really interesting vignettes about people we might consider heroes in many ways. So talk a little bit about the decision to highlight some people that I'm sure many in this room may not know and wouldn't know until having read your book.
Right.
And do you have a favorite from all these vignettes of all these military heroes?
So so this book is basically, my first book was looking specifically at jihadism, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and what it's going to take to defeat them. That was Defeating Jihad. This time I wanted to broaden the aperture and use my time in the White House to talk about all the threats we face, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and how the president's going to deal with them. But then I learned a very important lesson from my first book. My first book was going to be a wonks book on counterterrorism written for wonks. Right? I was going to dive straight in and write about Syed Qutb, the Muslim Brotherhood, the evolution of the global jihadi movement, blah, 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 blah. And my wife looked at me and said, do you actually want to sell books? Or do you want 3 wonks and the library to buy it? And she said, you've got to connect with the reader. You've got to connect with the reader. And as such, I opened my first book with my personal hero, who is my father, who, as a child, when we were on holiday at the seaside, I must have been 8 years old, he comes out of the sea. He was a massive, he was an athlete, incredibly powerful man. And he comes out of the sea, and for the first time in my life, I realized he had these white lines on his wrists that clearly were not wrinkles. He was too young to be wrinkled. And I said to him, Dad, what are those? And he says, totally matter-of-factly, without skipping a beat, unemotional, he says, oh, that's where the secret police tied my wrist together with wire and hung me backwards from a pipe in the ceiling. So I grew up with that understanding of what evil is, that evil is real, and whether it's fascist, whether it's communist, or whether it's jihadi, it walks the earth. So the first chapter of my book, Defeating Jihad, was my father's story as a freedom fighter, as somebody who stood up for the truth and never surrendered. And the stunning thing is that I learned in the 2 years after it was published, it became a New York Times bestseller and it was widely read. Whenever I met anybody who'd read the book, they didn't want to talk to me about Bin Laden, Zawahiri, Qutb. They wanted to talk to me about my father. That chapter so resonated with people that I thought, okay, now I'm doing my second book. I can be a wonk again and just give in to my desires to write about nuclear weapons development on the Korean Peninsula, or I can actually connect with the readers again. So I cheated. I did both. I did the strategic stuff, and then interlaced are what we call these heroes vignettes, American warriors. I write about my father again, but then I talk about 4 American heroes. I talk about Stephen Decatur, youngest naval captain in the history of the United States, made a captain at the age of 24 by Jefferson. Why? Because he led 20 Marines in a covert mission to recapture a captured U.S. vessel from the Barbary pirates off the shores of Tripoli. That's why that line is in the Marine Corps anthem. It's not because Marines like to go on holiday to the Barbary coast. It's because we were fighting jihadis almost from the inception of our republic. Not 9/11, not the First World Trade Center. Almost from the birth of our nation, our ships were being taken hostage. Our sailors and citizens were being enslaved by the states of North Africa. And Jefferson had enough when he became president, and he deployed this team to take back the USS Philadelphia, and Stephen Decatur led that mission. An amazing, amazing story. Then I write about Chesty Puller, Marine Corps legend. I love my devil dogs. Chesty Puller, a man who almost single-handedly at the Battle of Henderson Field turned around the war in the Pacific in World War II. Henderson Field in the Guadalcanal was absolutely essential to the island-hopping strategy, and Japan needed Henderson Field in a 2-day battle when the Marines were totally outnumbered without any organic reserves. Chesty Puller turned that battle around, and therefore the war in the Pacific. So I wanted to share that incredible, how one man can turn the tide of a war. And then I write about Whittaker Chambers, a man who'd never worn a uniform, never carried a gun, but he's as much a hero as any American. Why? Because he was Judge Kavanaugh before Judge Kavanaugh was born. I didn't know what was going to happen with Judge Kavanaugh when the book was written. But I had to counsel my friends. Why are you shocked at what the Democrat Party did to this godly man, Judge Kavanaugh? Why are you shocked that they took an upstanding, righteous man and accused him of being a serial rapist who drugged girls? Why are you shocked? This isn't the first time they've done it. They did it in 1948 to Whittaker Chambers, a man who was a committed communist, was a covert agent of the Kremlin, ran the covert pipeline of information from Moscow to US agents inside the government, Soviet agents in the US government, who during the war and after the pact with Stalin, after Hitler's pact with Stalin, ditched communism, found God, found America, and after the war decided I have a duty and a responsibility to share my knowledge with the government and tell them where the spies are, including al-Jahis. And in the first televised congressional testimony of its kind, Whittaker Chambers stood up for the truth. And he said, al-Jahis is a communist and I was his courier. What happened? Al-Jahis, incredibly influential former presidential advisor, was a darling of the left, darling of the Democrat Party. As such, they unleashed the hounds of hell. They accused Whittaker Chambers of being a homosexual, an alcoholic, and of being responsible for the death of his brother. This is the modus operandi. Before Saul Alinsky wrote his book, the left did politics of personal destruction. And he never stood down, and he stood by the truth, and al-Jahis was convicted, not of being a communist, there was a statute of limitations, but of committing perjury. But then in the 1980s, long after al-Jahis died, the US government decided to declassify the Venona decrypts of Soviet signals intelligence, which proved that al-Jahis was an agent of Moscow. So, lest you think Kavanaugh is new, Justice Kavanaugh has happened again and again and again in American politics. But my favorite one, you asked me about my favorite one, is the third one, chronologically. And that's a man who's still alive and who I've had the honor of meeting, and that's Eugene Red McDaniel, captain in the US Navy, naval aviator, shot down over Vietnam. A man who was captured by the Viet Cong and held as a prisoner in the Hanoi Hilton for more than 6 years. A man who was relentlessly beaten and tortured for 6 years, but a man who never lost faith in his savior, never lost faith in America. And the remarkable thing, I've had grown men, I've had editors tell me that they cried when they read this chapter. There's a moment in his imprisonment where his fellow Americans tried to escape. And he's not part of the plot, but when the plot is uncovered, he is accused of being part of the plot. And in order to save his fellow Americans, who he knew were in worse shape than him and would die, he said to his interrogators, "It was my plan. I did it." And he took the torture for his fellow Americans. And that's what heroism is. So my favorite, Eugene Red McDaniel.
Yeah, and the stories are fantastic because I think they really bring to life some of the, not just the heroism, but frankly, I think some of the ways in which things have shifted in this country in terms of the way that we view these things. So I want to talk a little bit about one of the central themes of the book, I think, is the idea that our conception of warfare, the old conception of warfare, is really old. And policymakers maybe haven't caught on to the fact that warfare from the era of World War II is simply not the kind of warfare that we find ourselves engaged in today. Talk a little bit about that transition and maybe why it is that the foreign policy establishment, as it were, is so ill-equipped to understand this transition.
How long do we have? 5 hours? I mean, on that last point, can we just look, I don't care who you vote for or why you're here, look at the last 30 years of the elite's decisions. Whoever the president was, whether it was Clinton or it was Bush, we have had decades of strategic imbeciles making decisions. I mean, really, you know, the crème de la crème, from Kissinger empowering China. China is our peer competitor thanks to Kissinger. From any administration on left or right that believes you can create democracy at the end of a gun barrel, or that the Hindu Kush will look like Switzerland if we spend another 7 trillion. I mean, this is one of the moments I love the most when the president goes off script at his rallies, where he says, "Elite? What elite? You are the super elite." I love this thing that Steve Bannon. My old boss has this line. I don't know if he stole it from somebody else, and he uses it again and again and again, but he's absolutely right. I think he's quoting somebody else when he says this. I would prefer, do you remember phone books? Right? Phone books. I would prefer to have the country run by the first 200 names in a phone book than by anybody in the swamp. And he's right. I mean, the lack of just common sense. I'll share with you one thing. The president, I can't go into details, but at a certain meeting about a certain partner nation that we defend, the president said to the general, "So, hang on, who pays for that missile system that's on their territory defending them?" And the general goes, "Oh, we do, Mr. President. We do? But this is a rich nation. We buy their products. Why are we paying for their defense?" And then, second question, "How much is it costing us, General?" The general said, "I don't know, Mr. President." This is the elite. This is why a businessman has achieved more in 2 years in the White House than most presidents do in 8, because he fixes problems. To the first question on war, very simply, if I say the word war to you or to a layman or to somebody who's not, Victor Davis Hanson, what images flash across your mind? For most people, when you say war, if it's a Brit, you probably think of, the Battle of Britain, the trenches of Belgium. For an American, in the last 40 years, I think you think of, Tom Hanks and Saving Private Ryan. Right? I mean, these are the images. The Battle of the Bulge, for example, the Marines landing on Guadalcanal. This is what you think about war. Well, I'm afraid to disabuse you of that understanding. That is not war. If you look at the last 2,000 years of history, war is not usually nation states sending their regularized forces to fight the regularized forces of other nation states. What we call in taxonomy conventional warfare. Conventional warfare is the anomaly. In the book, I have a chart at the beginning from the Correlates of War database at Pennsylvania University, which always, whenever I put it in a briefing when I worked in DoD, every general would just get stuck on this briefing, on that one slide and want to discuss it. The Correlates of War database contains all the metadata from every war since Napoleon. It's unclassified. Anybody, you can check it out. So it's all the key data for the last 200 years. Who was in the war? Who was involved? Who won? How long did it last? How many killed? According to this database that lists a war as an armed conflict with over 1,000 casualties, since Napoleon there have been 460 wars in the world, 460. If you break them into classes of conventional warfare vice irregular warfare, you find something stunning. Less than 20% of all war since Napoleon is governments fighting other governments. Is, Tom Hanks in his uniform fighting a German. 80% of war is usually a government sending its forces to fight a non-state actor. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean the Barbary pirates off the shores of Tripoli. I mean the Mau Mau. I mean Al-Qaeda. I mean the Taliban. That thing which we deem irregular is in fact the norm. We as a nation and the West likes to practice and prepare for conventional war. Why? It's easy. Tanks versus tanks. Fighter planes dogfighting fighter planes. I know how strong you are because I can count your tank divisions. What was it that Stalin said? Who cares about the Pope? How many tank divisions does he have, right? Measurements of power that are very conventional and unimaginative. The fact is, I was in the Pentagon for a meeting, and I was early, and there's something called the Hall of Heroes on the ground floor, where they do the medal ceremonies, where if you get a Medal of Honor, this is the room. And along the walls are the lists of every conflict the Republic has been engaged in, and the names of individuals who received the Medal of Honor. Please, request personal, it's not the Congressional Medal of Honor. It's wrong. It's not the Congress's to give. It is the American Medal of Honor. And I was early, and I decided to do a little research. So I took a little notepad, and I listed every single war, and then I divided them into whether it was fighting another country or fighting a band of whatevers. Of the wars listed in the Hall of Heroes in the Pentagon, 17, 12 of them were not fighting other nations. 12 of them were fighting bandits, terrorists, insurgents. So our understanding of war is based upon the kinds of conflict we like to prosecute, not the ones that are most common, and that has really stymied us for several decades.
So do you think that the president understands this piece that you're talking about, and maybe we can use that to broaden out a little bit and think about, since the president's taken office, what, if you had to identify the top national security accomplishments of the administration, what would you say those are? Because, we get there's a lot of counter-programming out there, right? There's a lot of folks who are trying to argue that there's glowing assessments of President Obama's foreign policy, which, the proof is in the pudding in terms of where the world was when Barack Obama left office. That having been said, how would you assess the president's understanding of what you just said and what he has done during his time in office to reflect that?
So the president's starting point is a different one. The president doesn't start with, sitting down for days and days, diving into the Correlates of War database at Pennsylvania University. That's not his job. He's got more important things to do. His approach to everything, whether it's the cost of missile defense in Asia or whether it's, the price of prescription drugs for Americans, is always the same. His starting point is, this is broken. Somebody needs to fix it, and they haven't. I'm going to fix it. So he looks at these things. I'll explain to you how this works out in real life. You don't have to get in an argument with him about the taxonomy of conflict. You'll be in a meeting on the future of Afghanistan. And I can't go into the details, but I'll give you an example of his approach to common sense solutions. I promised the president I wouldn't lambast anybody who's in the administration, but H.R. McMaster has left. So H.R. McMaster, as is known, is a former cavalry officer who likes armor and big footprint operations. He likes to double down. He likes to go big, not very imaginative in his approaches. He repeatedly tried to sell to the president the idea that we need to invest more troops in Afghanistan, that we need to double down on Afghanistan. And the president wasn't buying it. And he tried 6 times at principal level to convince the president. Now, if you're in a company and you're an advisor to the CEO, and you try and pitch the CEO on an idea 3 times and he doesn't buy it, you should probably give up, right? Not H.R. McMaster. He tried another 6 times. And in the final meeting, HR prepared a very nice deck of PowerPoint slides, death by PowerPoint. And the president flicked through them quickly, and he said, this sentence that's on every slide, what are you talking about, General? And every single slide started with the same sentence, whatever the issue was. The ring road around Kabul, IED attacks, what have you. Every single slide started with, the federal government of Afghanistan will. And the president said to the general and his principals, what federal government of Afghanistan? You mean the mayor of Kabul? Right? It's just, there are no sacred cows for the president. And he cuts through the miasma of elite misrepresentation of truth. There is no functioning. I was in Afghanistan in 2006. In Afghanistan, in one area in Kandahar, this is unclassified. You can read it at the Institute of War website. In one city, there were 17 independent military organizations, only 5 of which were loyal to the president of the nation. 17. So what federal government are we talking about? So the president's approach to all policy questions is, this is wrong, it's broken, let's fix it. And that's why he's always results-oriented.
The one area, so I'm just to kind of think about this in a practical context, one area where it seems like he's been driven by that desire to get results is North Korea.
Yes.
And it was something that was happening during your time in the administration. Can you talk a little bit about, without divulging details obviously, about the president's approach there and whether you think it's been effective and what happens next?
Yeah. Well, has it been effective? Let's put it into historic context. The Korean War was not ended. It did not end with a peace treaty. There is no peace treaty. The Korean War in 1953 ended with an armistice. It is in a temporary ceasefire. To this very day, that war is simply in stasis. The two sides have decided not to shoot at each other for now. And in the meantime, for the last 25 years, one of the belligerents has been building a nuclear capacity, which they have been illegally testing. I mean, let's remind ourselves, nuclear weapons have been detonated by the North Koreans to test their new warheads, and they have launched ballistic missiles over the Sea of Japan, over our partner, Japan, over Japan. And the president comes along and does what? And I don't want to give all his secrets away, because my third book is The Art of Winning, Why Donald Trump Never Loses. And I've got 3 weeks to finish it. And I list the 6 principles of why he wins, and I'll give one away. With regimes like North Korea, which really are tin pot dictatorships, this is a tin pot dictatorship that is kept alive by China. With regimes like that, what you do is you create disturbances in the force, okay? You get them disturbed. You rattle their cage. And you make them wonder about the future of their lives. And this isn't just the president. Remember, General Mattis, Secretary Mattis said, if you threaten America, we will destroy your regime. That is a 4-star retired Marine Corps legend. You disturb their sense of equilibrium and their sense that they can continue to blackmail you over nuclear weapons. And then you get out the carrot. I was in Singapore for the summit. Sean Hannity flew me over. And I still have not found out if it was us or whether it was the Singaporeans or whether it was somebody else. But pure genius. So he rattled their cage. They're worried about the future of their regime. The president's tweeting at 2 a.m., "We will destroy you." And yeah, he's writing those tweets. At 2 a.m., he's writing them. And then what did they do? The day before the summit, pure genius, there's a resort there, an incredible, it looks like something out of Blade Runner. There are 3, I think it's 47-story high buildings next to each other with what looks like an ocean liner on top of them, connecting all. I mean, it truly is out of science fiction. It's Philip K. Dick. It's 3 massive buildings with this huge superstructure that connects all of them with restaurants and clubs and whatever. What did they do the day before? Kim had a private tour of that resort to show him, do you know what Singapore was like 40 years ago? Total utter backwater. Oh, look, what it's like now. Interesting. This is what an Asian nation with 0 resources can transition to. What do you think about that? That is the art of the deal.
So in the book, you talk about the 3 biggest threats you identify.
Right.
So one is, we should spend some time talking about one, which is radical Islamic jihadism, and then Russia and China.
Right.
So on each of those, have we made progress in this administration, and if so, what?
On China, we've made massive progress inside the White House and also nationally, but not enough. So what do I mean by that? When the president came, look, the president has understood China for 30. Go back and watch his interviews with Oprah 20 years ago. Go back and watch what he said about China 30. He understands the threat that is China. But when he came to the White House, as a businessman, he thought, allow them to invest in America. Their money's green, so what harm can it do? We turned him around on that. We gave him a series of classified briefings on what China is doing in America, in our allies' countries, how the Confucian institutes are undermining Judeo-Christian culture, how they're stealing our intellectual property left, right, and center. So the commander-in-chief of the free world now understands the strategic threat that China poses to Western civilization. And as such, he has launched the 302 investigation. He's launched the tariffs against China. Our big problem now is that the thing that still has to be done is here, is California, is Silicon Valley. When Google, whose motto is what? Don't do evil. Their motto is don't do evil. Literally gets in bed with the Communist Party of China to assist them in censoring the internet from their own citizens. We have a real problem. When Google decides to build its first world-class artificial intelligence research facility, not in Palo Alto, not in Boston, but in China, we have a problem, Houston. Artificial intelligence is the future of technology. Every single line of code written in that Chinese research facility will be piped directly into the Chinese government. So we have a lot of work to do on educating America and American businesses on the threat China faces. On Iran, great news. What does Sipowicz always say on NYPD Blue? We're squeezing their shoes. We are squeezing the mullah's shoes. With the cancellation of the JCPOA, with great people like Ambassador Rick Grenell in Germany, we have sent a very clear message to the world. You have a simple choice to make. You can trade with America, or you can trade with Iran. You cannot trade with both. This is a regime that is the Shia version of ISIS. ISIS created the Sunni caliphate, the re-theocratization of the Sunni world under their vision. We've almost destroyed ISIS in the 3 countries where the caliphate existed. Now, Iran wishes to export its Shia version of the caliphate all the way across the region down to the Bekaa Valley. The president has put a brake on that. They're not giving up, but it's moving in the right direction. With regards to North Korea, we've discussed that. One thing on North Korea. Think about this metric. Whatever the reports are about this missile base, that engine facility, the North Korean regime, the Hermit Kingdom, returned the bodies of 50 GIs lost in the Korean War on the 65th anniversary of the armistice. That is a very important message. That did not happen by accident. They could have shipped it on any day. Those bodies could have come anytime. But they decided to ship those bodies back to their families on the anniversary of the armistice. That is a very strong signal that things are moving in the right direction. Lastly, on Russia. Russia, too early to say. I'll quote the president from, do you remember his last press conference in Trump Tower? The one where he handed over his businesses to his children. He'd finished the press conference and was leaving, and some puerile journalist shouted out, "What about Vlad? What about Russia?" And the president stopped, and he gave the best one-sentence summary of his attitude to Russia that still stands today, 2 years later. The president responded, "In theory, I would like to have better relations with Russia." Why not? It's a member of the UN Security Council, has nuclear weapons, and has 11 time zones. Not 3, not 4, 11. This is not Vanuatu, okay? So it's a geopolitical player, whether you like it or not. We should have better relations. But then he added, right now, it doesn't really seem likely. And then he finished by saying, if that's the case, so be it. The pragmatist's approach. Russia is an anti-status quo actor. It wishes to create disturbances around the world and then exploit them for their own benefit. And it is still run by a former KGB colonel. Mustn't forget that. Mustn't forget that. A former KGB colonel. When I read the comment blogs on conservative sites, and they say, "Oh, Vladimir Putin, a wonderful leader who will save Western civilization and the Christian world." And I have to remind them, you do know what the KGB did to Christians, right? Whether it's Father Papiescu murdered in Poland, shoved into the back of a trunk of a car, or Christians being tortured, Christians being kicked out of university. That's who Vladimir Putin is. It was going well. If you think of one metric, we killed more than 200 Russian contractors in Syria. By contractors, these are special forces soldiers who have been ordered to take their uniforms off, leave their ID cards at home, and deploy into theater. Okay, these are black ops. We killed 200 of them. Vladimir Putin didn't squeak. That's how weak he is. But what he's done in the last 72 hours means that you cannot teach an old dog new tricks. He is continuing to destabilize Ukraine. He's trying to control the Sea of Azov, put a stranglehold on free nations. But he's testing the wrong man. So I think good in all directions, but the jury is still out on Russia.
What's the one thing that we're not paying attention to that you think is a problem that we should be paying attention to in this regard?
I'll go a little bit left field on you, if I may. The thing that the victims of communism Memorial Foundation does a massive survey every year, and in it they poll millennials, American millennials, and they just released their latest poll, and in it 52% of American youth want to live in a socialist or communist America. That's after 40 nations have tried to be socialist nations in the last 100 years. 40. And that's after more than 100 million human souls were exterminated in the name of Karl Marx. And American children want to turn this nation into Venezuela Watch the video on YouTube of my friend Ami Horowitz. Ami Horowitz went to Venezuela recently and interviewed people. The first person he interviews is a man walking through a public park trying to catch a cat or a pigeon to feed his family. Senator Sanders wants to create that in America. So I don't worry about the international threats. We will deal with them. We have President Trump for the next 6 years, rest assured. What we need to do right now is to, with personal testimony from people who've lived in those regimes, convince Americans of every class, every background, that socialism is evil. Is evil. You can be a Democrat, you can wish to have compassionate policies, free education, I understand that. But if you do it in the name of socialism, as 40 Democrat candidates in the midterms did, 40 candidates of the Democrat Party called themselves avowed socialists. If you do it in the name of socialism, you are riding roughshod over the graves of my parents and 100 million people who were killed and hundreds of millions of people who were tortured and persecuted in the name of equality. So, biggest challenge, understanding the 20th century's history.
So is it a lack of understanding? What do you think motivates this? This is quite a staggering thing, this 40 candidate. I mean, the degree to which I think this is a strain on the left, more than a strain now. It's arguably the dominant strain as we move toward 2020. What's motivating this?
Look, I've been doing a lot of guest hosting for Salem Radio. I had start my new show. Actually, here it'll be broadcast here on AM 860 starting January 1st. And I use a metaphor. I use a discussion when I'm guest hosting for people like Dennis Prager and others. How did it occur? Think about the last 40 years. For the last 40 years, this nation was increasingly covered in a thicker and thicker layer of ice. Permafrost ice. And that ice was political correctness. Every year it grew. And if you want to know why it grew and who's responsible, I've got some bad news for you. Look in the mirror. If you're a conservative, it's your fault. In 1968, we had the French riots. We had Maoist revolutionaries in America called the Weather Underground and the SDS, believed that they could engender a Marxist revolution in America. Days of Rage, Bernardine Dawn, Bill Ayers. They failed. They fizzled out. This is the land of, freedom, liberty, made in the image of our Creator, and it died a death. But these individuals did not go back to their townhouses in New York or to their rich daddies, didn't become farmers or poets. What did they become? Tenured professors in Chicago. Tenured professors. We ceded our schools to the radical left, to the point at which today the birthplace, the so-called birthplace of the free speech movement, Berkeley, bans or makes it logistically impossible for an Orthodox Jew like Ben Shapiro to speak about his views. Or they charge him $300,000 for security to go to the birthplace of freedom of speech, where we have established universities today, 40 years later, where there are free speech zones. Sorry? I may have a funny accent, but I'm an American now. And as far as I'm concerned, the free speech zone in America expands from the Canadian to Mexican border and from the Pacific to the Atlantic. That's the free speech zone. So how did it happen? What was it, slouching towards Gomorrah? We lurched for the snooze button for 40 years. And it took a man of Donald Trump's character and Donald Trump's backbone, and this is what I use on the radio show for Salem, to come along like an icebreaker, like an ice-breaking ship. He just smashed through the ice and created a pathway to freedom. But if you know the physics of ice breaking, One ice-breaking ship doth not a free sea lane make. If you don't have a flotilla behind it that keeps that sea lane open, you know what happens in real life? You deploy an icebreaker, cuts a channel through the sea lane, immediately the chunks of ice come around the hull and instantaneously re-knit and refreeze behind that ship, cutting it off again. There has to be a flotilla, an armada that comes behind it and keeps it open. Americans must be that armada. Whether you vote Democrat or Republican, I don't care. But if you believe in freedom of speech, it is your responsibility. If you understand what the Founding Fathers fought for, against persecution, against oppression, for freedom of religion, for recognition that we are all made equal, that is our duty, that is our responsibility. So why did it happen? It happened because of us.
The one question we often get here, being in San Francisco or in the Bay Area, is what people here can do to effectuate some of what you're talking about.
Very easy. Never give up. Never, look, I'm not talking about Winston Churchill, I'm talking about Donald Trump. Donald Trump, why do you think he did what he did? He didn't need the money, that massive government paycheck, right? Which is actually donating back to the government. And I don't think he needed the fame. I'm sure he was pretty famous enough. He truly is doing it for love of country because he saw a city, Washington, that was broken and an elite on left and right that had betrayed the people who empowered them. And I'm sorry, GOP, Donald Trump won despite you, not thanks to you. The first time in American history that we elected a man who was neither a former politician or a general. We've never done that before. Every single president has been a governor, senator, congressman, or a general like Washington and Eisenhower. We picked somebody who's a rank outsider because he owes nothing. This is why he's so dangerous to the establishment. He owes them nothing. Nothing. So you need to take a page out of his book and never give up. I mean, think about it. What is he has increased the stock market by 25%, lowered unemployment to now, we have functionally zero unemployment. There are more jobs available now in America than people seeking jobs, which means zero unemployment. The lowest unemployment for Hispanics and blacks since we started keeping records on minority unemployment. And we're complaining about his tweets? Suck it up, snowflakes. I mean, really. So I gave a speech in Sacramento last night, packed audience, and I had the same question. Never give up, never stand down. 2016 was a peaceful political revolution. Anything is possible. Even California can be conservative. Even California. Never give up. And the most important thing you can do, yes, you can write checks to candidates. Yes, you can knock on doors, distribute leaflets. But the most powerful thing today, social media. Truly is. Even despite the censorship, the dead naming, and everything else, there's a reason Donald Trump has 56 million followers on Twitter. There's a reason. You must use the tools available to us for free to talk about the truth, to take back the republic, to talk about the history. I mean, when you remind youngsters, do you know what party the great emancipator was from? He was a Republican. Yeah, Lincoln was not a Democrat. Do you know who created the KKK? Wasn't the Republic. Do you know why, in part, the NRA was created? To help freed black Americans defend themselves from lynchings. That's why. So stand up for the truth. Don't let them distort our history. And don't give up.
So, that can be challenging in the media environment, particularly in the media environment. You spend a lot of time in the media. Maybe we can close with some of your observations about the media and productive, not productive, elements of it that are productive, and what's been your experience having done and been, I won't say been a part of the media, but been involved in the media for as long as you have?
There is no media. There is no media. There are some people, a handful of people who try to provide information. There's a tiny group of people that are investigative journalists left. I mean, literally, a handful. Sarah Carter, Lee Smith at the Tablet, tiny amount. And the rest are political activists. When you have anchors daily, calling the duly elected president of the United States a white supremacist, a bigot, and an anti-Semite, that is not journalism. This man's daughter is an Orthodox Jew. His highest-ranking advisor, his son-in-law, is an Orthodox Jew. This man's grandchildren are Orthodox Jews. This man's first pardons in office included the heavyweight boxer Jackson, who was persecuted solely on racial lines, and the release of an African-American grandmother who was in prison as a drug dealer. It is disgusting. It is shameful. My personal experience, I knew I was going to be a proxy for the president. I knew I was going to be a proxy for Steve Bannon. So I was ready for the slings and arrows. But when somebody who says they're a journalist starts to attack not only me, but my wife, my dead mother, and my teenage-aged high school son, you have no right to call yourself a journalist. But it's okay, because you know what? I don't have those lines on my wrist like my father did. So I've told them. Just today, the New York Times was emailing me for comment. I said, I don't help institutions that systematically see their agenda as undermining the president. But bring the attacks, because I won't give up, and neither will the president. So the state of the media is absolutely appalling today, and that is why social media is all the more important.
Well, I think I can speak for everyone when I say that this has been insightful to hear from you. You should get the book. It's interesting. It's got some great mix of policy and personal, and the vignettes are terrific. Also, the radio show starts January 1st?
January 1st, AM 860, Hear the Answer, national radio show with Salem Radio, 12 to 3 every day on the West Coast, and I can't wait.
Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking Dr. Sebastian Gorka.
Thank you.
Thank you.